and I'm really honored to be on the ancestral unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people with an amazing group of very wise women. Rhiannon Bennett, I don't know which side you are, but I will introduce everyone in more depth a little later. Halena Seiferling, Andrea Reimer, former city councillor, and the other co-chair of Women Transforming Cities, Joy Masahara. So this is the third of a series of webinars on, the first one was about Dare to Run with Mayor Tony Boots and Christian Wong Tam from Toronto. And who am I forgetting? Of course I'm forgetting somebody. And then Nadine Nakagawa from New Westminster, who is a sitting city councillor. And then we had a second one about engaging people in the civic process, particularly immigrant and refugee women and Asian women, Indigenous women, etc., and the lack of representation of various, of a wide diversity of the majority of women who normally are not represented on council. And this is the third, which is electoral reform. And who knows what we'll go on to next. This came out of a project that we worked on with the Canadian Research Institute for the Advancement of Women called Action on Systemic Barriers to Women's Participation in Local Government. We have other projects we work on, one's called Watch Council. So we're watching council develop their city budget, and we're speaking out on that. The climate change motion, we spoke out on that. We called for a feminist, just, green economic recovery strategy with women at the table. We were able to get a motion through to put a gender intersectional lens, measurable and supported for 6 years on all departments last May 29th. And we have a wonderful website that Dr. Joy Masahara is the lead on. It's Women Friendly Cities Challenge. It's an online library of wise practices tied to the SDGs, CEDA, and the New Urban Agenda. So these are a few of the things that Women Transforming Cities has been working on, some of them for a number of years, and some of them we've just started to focus on right now. And when we're at the midway point between the election and the next election in 2022, so we're working on the mayor and council's commitments to the Hot Pink Paper campaign. So I think that at this point, we're going to have some questions for the audience to fill in, and they will slowly appear on the screen. Okay, so I hope everybody can see these questions, and they'll be up for about 30 seconds, and then they'll come down and there'll be another series of questions. And then I will introduce the speakers in depth. If you have any questions for any of the speakers, please feel free to put them in the Q&A session, and we'll try to respond to as many of them as possible. We're asking these questions because we'd like to know who is underrepresented in our events and to allow us to impose our outreach and continue to address barriers to participation. And we know there are many more questions we could ask to understand people's identities, but we're just asking 3 main ones tonight. Oh, we're up to 38 participants. So we'll give everybody 20 more seconds to fill in this questionnaire. And then I'm going to introduce Dr. Joy Masahara, the co-chair of Women Transforming Cities. And she's going to present the organization and the situation for women in cities in the Lower Mainland. All right. Now, okay. So Joy, would you like to proceed?
Sure. Okay, thank you, Ellen, and welcome everyone. Welcome from Women Transforming Cities. Just before we start, I'd just like to acknowledge Ellen did mention this 3-year project. This is actually the last event of a 3-year project that we've been doing in partnership with the Canadian Research Institute for the Advancement of Women, and we'd like to just acknowledge their participation. I see that Marion is here. Thank you, Marion, for being here. And I would also like to acknowledge the Department of Women and Gender Equality who funded our 3-year project. So I guess I just want to just introduce this topic and actually tell you a little bit about some of the findings from the project. So in case you weren't really sure about it, this webinar is about electoral reform. Now, it's not a subject that I would naturally gravitate towards, but lately, like many people, I have been thinking more about racism in our world and of my own lived experiences as a 3rd-generation Japanese Canadian. So I was born and grew up in Vancouver, and when I think back on the mayors and council of my childhood, I don't recall seeing many or even any that looked like me. In fact, when I was growing up, city councillors were called aldermen. So that was a time, I'm dating myself, but anyway, that was a time when I, as an Asian Canadian, was a distinct minority in the city. But now Vancouver has grown and become increasingly multicultural, with the population of Metro Vancouver now more than 50% non-white. So I thought I would take a look at the current city councils and mayors in Metro Vancouver and see what they look like now. Because we don't collect disaggregated data, I had to use the non-scientific method of looking at photos and reading bios to determine gender, race, or indigeneity. So my apologies if my numbers are inaccurate or I have assigned genders in error. So I looked at 16 municipalities that have a population around 20,000 or more in Metro Vancouver. And most municipalities have 6 or 8 councillors, Vancouver being the exception at 10. So there was a total of 110 councillors and 16 mayors. Of the mayors, all were white, 3 women, 13 men. Of the councillors, 53 of the 110, which is 48%, were women. And this is fabulous. I actually didn't know that there were that many. And certainly our project has found that over the election cycles, there have been more and more women being elected to office. But when I looked at race, only 13 of the 110, less than 12%, were non-white. None that I could determine using my aforementioned pseudo-scientific methods were Indigenous. Of the 13 non-white councillors, 8 were men and 5 were women. I could only find 3 city councillors in all of Metro Vancouver who looked like me. And actually, they didn't actually look like me, they were much younger. So this lack of diversity is not just happening here, but is also seen in large multicultural urban centers across Canada. At the municipal level, governments are not representative of the people they serve. Does this matter? I think so, and Women Transforming Cities think so, and so do many others. So why does it matter? Well, evidence supports that having better representation increases trust in government, increases the engagement of citizens, and can result in more inclusive policies. But really, the main reason to have more representative governments is that it is just more fair. So how can this lack of diversity be improved? Well, our project looked at some of the factors that hindered and enabled diverse women to participate at the elected level and also to get elected. So there are, of course, many, many factors, individual, structural, and systemic. From our interviews and forums with diverse women who had run for office, some successfully, some not, certain themes arose. The at-large voting system was seen as a barrier for most. Campaigning across the entire city was seen as challenging, both financially and in terms of time, with women's unpaid work being a factor in balancing time commitments. Some women felt that wards would ease things both financially and in terms of time constraints. Others note that having recognition in a district community can increase chances of being elected. The party system was also felt to be beneficial for some in diffusing costs, improving networks and voter recognition. When we spoke with parties in Surrey and Vancouver, some had policies regarding gender and diversity quotas, but most did not. Diverse women also talked about the double glass ceiling they experienced running for office. So if we look at the academic literature, we see that there's been much debate over the years about various electoral systems and their effects on things like gender parity, representation, accountability, voter turnout, and engagement. There does appear to be evidence for wards and proportional representation to improve racial diversity. No system seems to consistently improve gender parity, but as I previously discussed, many women do feel wards would be beneficial. It is likely that factors are more complex and that it is difficult to separate out the effects of particular systems on specific outcomes. Studies will often not use an intersectional approach, so that some that examine gender don't look at race, and vice versa. So never mind all the other intersections to consider. So with this in mind, I'm really excited to hear from our expert panel today about what systems they think will help to improve the much needed diversity on our city councils. So Women Transforming Cities has been calling for electoral reform for many years as part of our Hot Pink Paper campaign. We have asked parties and candidates to commit towards and proportional voting systems. The City of Vancouver Independent Election Task Force also recommended electoral reform in 2017, and our 3-year project made these recommendations as well. Our project also noted that robust voter engagement and education were also necessary to improve representation. So I'd like to close with a quote from Erin Moore from a paper on electoral reform out of the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance from the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. So he states, municipal elections are complex, and no one change will address all the problems in an existing system. In fact, with change can come new problems, as in San Francisco's experience with ranked ballots. Voters are also complex and cannot be expected to behave in a predictable manner when the rules change. This is not reason to avoid change, however. If there is a real chance that reform can lead to positive change, then the electorate should be willing to consider reform. So it is 2020. We've had just an incredible year this year. 50 years ago, as a young girl, I was not seeing myself being represented in the city government, and I'm still not seeing it now. It is time for change. So thank you, and I hope we have a wonderful discussion tonight, and that you'll be just much more interested in electoral reform. I certainly, in my preparing for this little talk, have certainly become a lot more interested in electoral reform. We'll see what the discussion holds. Thanks. Back to you, Ellen.
Thank you. Yes. So we have 2 years before the next municipal elections at 2022. So I'd like to introduce our amazing panel of wise women. So first off, Halena Seiferling, who is a policy analyst, community organizer, and artist based in Vancouver. She was a researcher on the recently completed Action on Systemic Barriers to Women's Participation in Local Government project with Women Transforming Cities and the Canadian Research Institute for the Advancement of Women, CREA. She has a master's in public policy from Simon Fraser University, where her thesis focused on how to encourage more women to run for office at the municipal level. Halena has also worked on electoral reform, campaign financing, and climate change adaptation within a municipal policy setting. And from 2016 to 2019, she served on the City of Vancouver's Independent Election Task Force, which made recommendations through 2 robust reports focused on increasing civic engagement, voter turnout, and fairness in election campaigns. Rhiannon Bennett. Rhiannon is a much sought after speaker, moderator, and activist. She's well known for asking tough questions in a manner that encourages engagement and dialogue. She's actively working to create a more equitable world for all. She is Musqueam and was raised in Ladner with deep roots in the community, with some ancestors living on land since the first sunrise, and others who are part of the new fishing community arriving in the early 1900s. In 2014, she was the first Indigenous person elected to the Delta Board of Education. As a trustee, she focused on repairing and building stronger relationships with education partners, with ensuring a decolonization lens was applied to all board work. Andrea Reimer. Andrea Reimer is a public servant, organizer, and change maker who served 4 terms in local government from 2002 to 2018, including 10 years on Vancouver City Council, where she led groundbreaking policy efforts on social justice, greenest city, reconciliation, and the emerging economy. She was the driving force on many municipal engagement, governance, and electoral reforms, including successfully garnering provincial support to ban union, corporate, and large individual donations from municipal elections, and establishing Vancouver's first ever independent election task force. She didn't mention the gender equity strategy, which was her creation too. In 2018, she was awarded a Loeb Fellowship at Harvard in recognition of her civic leadership and current works as an educator and strategic advisor, teaching about power and supporting courageous leaders in government, nonprofits, and mission-driven businesses. She also currently holds volunteer positions as co-chair of the World Future Council's Climate and Energy Commission, co-chair of the Loeb Fellowship Alumni Governance Committee, and as a member of the UBC Board of Governors, where she chairs the Indigenous Engagement Committee. Now, if you have any questions of any of these speakers as they begin to share their knowledge with us, you can submit your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So the first question I've got for the entire panel, and Halena might want to adapt it a little bit. What is your experience as a woman running for elected office or supporting other women to run for elected office? Rhiannon, would you like to start?
Sure, thank you. So I had 2 vastly different experiences running between 2014 and 2018. When I ran in 2018, I was a single woman. I had a fair bit of time and capacity on my hands. So it was an interesting election out in Delta because the mayor was acclaimed that election cycle. So there was no vote on a mayor. So I was the most interesting part of that election cycle. I was the only Indigenous candidate running. There was a huge appetite for interest on the school board because I believe it wasn't, there was one election cycle before where I think the school board was even acclaimed one year. So there was 4 or 5, I think there's 5 all candidates that we did. And being the only Indigenous candidate, I got a lot of press. I was on the cover of the local paper 3 or 4 times throughout the election cycle. I didn't necessarily have the most organized, strongest team around me, but I worked really hard, had some really great messaging. But one thing that's sort of stands out is just that I had an abusive ex that was still sort of lingering in the background. That once my name was out, he popped up somewhere that was making me really uncomfortable. So ahead of every single public event, I would share his picture with the host and his name, and just to make sure that he wasn't just going to show up somewhere where I was. So that was something that I had to work through that election cycle. Like I didn't have my address published. I was really mindful about like my safety was a big issue for me that election. And I won. I beat out one of my running mates by 7 votes, and my name didn't cross the line until the last poll had reported. So it was the very last poll reported, and my name jumped over the line by 7 votes. That was it. So That's how I made history that election cycle. It was super close, like every vote counts. It was, and in hindsight, after my experience in 2018, I can really recognize how having no mayor running that election cycle really benefited me, and all of the extra media that I was getting was really helpful. Because in 2018, there was a bunch of people running for mayor, and it was incredibly hard to get any traction in the papers. I had a young child, I had a daughter, so I was busy parenting. I was a sitting trustee, so I still had duties and responsibilities that I had to attend to while campaigning. And my running mate was working like 3 or 4 jobs at the time while we were trying to campaign. And it was really hard for us to get the traction against all of the noise from everybody running for mayor. And we were the guinea pigs under the new election laws without being able to get the corporate and union donations. But one of the slates of people that we were running against had been fundraising before the laws had changed. So when I went back and looked at their donations, they had about $50,000 that they had raised from corporate donations before the law had changed. And we did not have $50,000 in our campaign budget. So it was, we were up against some very privileged and very deep pockets and very organized. And we had a huge uphill battle. And being an incumbent, I think that a lot of my champions and supporters had a lot of faith that I had it. Like, I don't think people were worried that I wasn't going to get reelected. I was an excellent school trustee. I did a lot of great work while I was on the board. I think people didn't show up for me in the way that I needed, because I don't think they recognized how much more support that I was in need of. And a lot of my champions were also running their own campaigns, seeking seats of their own. So that was really great. But it was a very isolating campaign run. It was very hard. My daughter decided that she wanted to toilet train in the middle of it. She shoved an orange peel up her nose one day. So I was supposed to be at my computer, like writing things, doing things, submitting things. And we were at the clinic, or we were working on potty training. Like, it was really hard. And one thing that really, I think really hurt our campaign, that election, was that I ran on a slate of women, progressive women, and as we were working out who was going to run, there was three white middle-aged men that were also progressive that were contemplating running. And I remember sitting down with them at the McDonald's, and I said, this is too many people to run for the number of seats that are on the board. This is the optics of this, is it's going to appear like a hostile takeover of essentially a functioning board. It's too many people to have on one slate. And I looked all of them in the eye, and I said, and the likelihood of me asking one of the women not to run is 0. So you need to figure out what it is that's going to happen, because this is too many people to run. There's not enough votes to go around. There's not enough money to go around. Having this many progressive run is going to be a problem. And they all looked at me and sort of shrugged their shoulders, and it's like, well, if we don't run together, I'll just run on my own. And then the 3 of them all ran together. And there were white privileged men who didn't have small children, who had lots of time to knock on doors, and were held to different standards than women are, right? So it was a really tough loss. There was definitely a lot of things that we needed to overcome, and it was just too many things stacked against us. So those were my experiences.
Andrea, Halena, who'd like to go next?
I can jump in. Yeah, although I'm still reflecting on Rhiannon's experiences, and I mean, just to acknowledge like how challenging it is, right? Like I'm in a big city where many years ago we evolved to have parties for exactly this reason, that it is very difficult to run on your own. There are difficult things about parties, don't get me wrong, but this kind of experience that Rhiannon went through is just, I mean, okay, so we're going to be asked like, what are the barriers? This is a barrier, right? For me, I've run 5 times for public office. I won 4 times. I don't know why, but no one ever remembers the time I didn't win, which is fine. Like, we don't need to memorialize that. But yeah, I've had the experience of losing. I also have run, like, chaired or co-chaired 7 campaigns. So I have a lot of backroom experience as well. I mean, backroom sounds so smoky, whatever. I mean, I tweet about my backroom experience, so it's not so secret, but to say that I'm not always the one on the stage talking, right? So that spans from 1996 until today, and to try and summarize that in, like, there's been many experiences, I would say. So I was thinking today, like, how to encapsulate it. I think what I would say is that it's so impossible to disconnect the experience of being, well, it's impossible for me and Rhiannon and Ellen, for you as a queer woman, and Halena, I'm sure we'll hear about your own experience both in academia and in and around electoral politics. It's impossible to disconnect the identity of being a woman from my identity as being a poor woman, as being a former sex worker and drug user, from being the things I'm not, right? I'm not a homeowner. I don't have a university degree, which are sort of common things in electoral politics. I have a ambiguous and until very recently unknown ethnicity, and spent a lot of my life having people ask me where I'm from and me being like, I'm adopted, I have no idea. And you have no idea how painful that question is to be asked over and over again. And so it's hard to, like, to think of all of that on a public stage and the sort of psychic energy you need around you. I don't mean like the future, but like just the mental energy and emotional energy you need to be able to power through being so much of the other, not being centrally located. Someone recently said to me that my skin is the wrong color. And I was like, wow, that just kind of sums it all up. So you always have to be learning someone else's language, right? I mean, metaphorically, but also just like technically, when you're talking about issues, you have to figure out how the dominant culture locates it. And then you think about how you locate it. And then you somehow have to build a bridge back and forth, right? And I think that's true for a white woman who owns a house and is university educated, and no one's ever going to ask her where she's from, but she has also got to do that because it is a men's politics is still very much dominated by men, even today in 2020. It's changed quite a bit, I'd say, in the last 5 years or so. I've seen the most substantial shifts, but it's not even halfway to where it needs to be, right? That only speaks to how bad it was, not how good it's gotten. So I think that quality or reality of just constantly every day in every single step you take, except, it's interesting, Ellen, that you mentioned that I forgot to put in the women's equity work, because that is the one place where, in general, when you get together with women to talk about women's policy, you don't have to do all this code switching, right? So it was like just a safe and relieving space, generally speaking, from this sort of, it sounds like an active onslaught. It's not. It's just that you're possibly always the wrong color, the wrong experience, the wrong type of housing tenure, like the wrong something. So you're sort of constantly trying to adjust yourself to fit into whatever right is. And that just is tiring to have to put in that effort, but also be reminded that you're not all these things that someone has decided are important to be. So I also would say, like, I was consistently, even right up to when I decided to leave politics, consistently underestimated because I was a woman, because I was younger, because I didn't have all these things you're supposed to have. And that actually kind of worked to my benefit, because yeah, you want to underestimate me, fine. Like, I'm still gonna win this policy or whatever. Like, that's why I was celebrating campaign finance reform. You would not believe how many people told me I would never get that done. And it took 14 years and bringing together a very big coalition of people and an NDP government getting elected, but we did get it done, right? So underestimate me all you want. I'm still going to keep working on the policies. And with that kind of coalition being built, I think you can be underestimated as long as you're successful in moving it forward.
I'm going to ask you a question you don't have to answer, Andrea. Why didn't you run as mayor?
Oh, so many reasons. I'm glad I was muted for the laugh because I might have, I might have laughed too hard there. I think that the short story, I really, when Donald Trump got elected, I know this isn't going to sound like a short story, but something really fundamentally changed in me that I just could not understand how a system that could produce that outcome could not be deeply flawed. Like I needed to get out of that system, the democracy government system, to understand it hurt me. It's like finding out that your favorite relative is actually a big jerk, right? Like that's something, this thing that I worship at, this democratic altar, actually had some fundamental structural flaw that I just couldn't see myself running as a mayor in that. And the other thing I'll tell you, I still don't believe a woman can win as mayor in Vancouver. Like the prejudice is very strong. I mean, being underestimated works when you can come in 10th and still be a councillor. It doesn't work when you can only be the only one who wins, right? I mean, the current mayor is got some strengths, but I would say if he was a woman, he'd be out of office by now, because you'd never get away with that level of lack of production of positive policies.
Halena, to Halena, I want to say there's a question in the chat. It says it would be good if someone could define a few of the terms which we're throwing around, we know, including at-large, ward system, and proportional representation. Could you take that on? You can add what you were going to say, but you're so well versed in this.
Sure, thank you. Hi, everyone. Yeah, in terms of my answer to this question first, it is just very brief because I think from my bio, it already included that I've done master's research in this. I've done a bunch of different research on different projects on this topic, but I haven't run myself. I haven't been really involved in the campaign side personally. So I don't really have much to say about that. But the kind of sad part, well, clearly, as we've heard, there are a lot of barriers for women to be able to run for office in different ways based on their different experiences and backgrounds. But even hearing the two of these women talk tonight, I'm kind of like, yep, I heard this in my research. I heard this from this person I interviewed. I heard this from this person I talked to. So it unfortunately, I guess, a lot of, I guess through the research I've done, I've heard a lot of different women's stories and experiences of the different barriers they have faced and the different experiences they've had. And I don't know what I might do in the future, but I think certainly that influences my thinking of whether I myself would run, because I'm like hearing from all of these women how hard it can be, right? Yeah, but that's really all that I have to say about that first question. I haven't practiced what I preach, so. But I can add some definitions. I think like later on, I know we're going to talk maybe a bit more specifically about electoral reform and different kinds of options, but in general, if it's so one thing to kind of clarify is the at-large versus the ward system that Joy was talking about a bit at the beginning. So if an election is at-large, basically that just means that everyone, like all the voters in the whole jurisdiction are voting amongst that whole area. So like that's how the current city council works in Vancouver, and yeah, I was going to say in other places, but no, actually not in a lot of other places. A lot of cities have wards, but that's how it works in Vancouver. So if you're a city councillor, for example, you have to campaign to the whole city because the whole city is voting for you. All of the voters across the city are able to vote for all of the 10 councillors. So the alternative to that is if you have a ward system, so it's kind of like geographic wards that divide up the city. So if you're a city councillor, you just have to vote, or you just have to run in your own ward. And I think as Ellen or Joy, one of you was mentioning at the beginning, I think that tends to be positive, especially maybe for women or for folks who maybe have a harder time running for office because thanks Andrea, I see a note, BC municipalities use the at-large system, yeah. Yeah, that can be easier for folks that maybe are marginalized or don't have as easy of a time running for office because they don't have to campaign to the whole city and sort of get name recognition beyond their community. They can focus their campaign efforts and their funding and their money in a smaller area in their own community. So that's a big distinction. I know I'm actually from Regina, Treaty 4 territory, and homeland of the Métis people as well. speaking of Blue Real Day today. But when I first moved here, I thought it was very odd how elections worked. I was very confused at first because we have a ward system in Regina, and it did seem to me like it made sense that, you know, the person I was trying to vote for was from my own kind of area of the city. So that's a main distinction. And then more broadly, if people talk about proportional representation, that term, in my understanding, sort of encompasses a lot of different like types of electoral systems. There's a lot of different things people talk about within that umbrella, but basically it just means a system where the kind of proportion of votes that the party gets matches the proportion of seats that they then get. So I think someone had put in the chat as well, if they get, you know, 46%, for example, of the vote, if a party gets that percent of the vote, they'd get that percent of the seats available as well, rather than how it works now where it's the first past the post. So the first person to get the most seats wins, and all of the rest of that chunk of votes doesn't go towards electing a candidate, even if it was like 40% to 35%, for example. That 35% of votes doesn't go anywhere in terms of electing someone. So hopefully that helps a bit. And again, I think throughout the rest of the questions, we'll get a little bit more into different systems as well.
Thank you so much, Halena. That's very helpful. I'm going to preface this next question, which you already have. And this has happened so often in these discussions. Why did you enjoy being elected? What motivated you? And you, Andrea, I knew you loved what you did when you were in council. We both worked hard, but there were some reasons why we were there, and we did accomplish things that I think we're all proud of. So Rhiannon, Andrea, who wants to start that one? Andrea, do you want to start that one?
Sure, I'll dive in, Rhiannon, if that's cool. What did I love about being elected? Well, I was reading, I mean, you know, Rhiannon and I were both sort of painting what could be perceived as a somewhat bleak picture about the realities of running for office when you're a woman.
Just a minute, this is an entry into why would you encourage other women to run?
So here's the thing, like, I've tried I've tried downplaying some of the negatives. I think it's not ultimately a good idea. You should go eyes wide open into it. I will tell you the harder thing than running for office and being represented is not running for office and not being represented, right? And that's why we are where we are, is we went through a few hundred years, well, a few hundred, 1,000 years of the patriarchy, and things haven't gone super well for us, right? When things have changed is when we elect, and someone else spoke to this, I was gonna highlight this. It's not about electing more women, it's about electing more feminists, right? And more anti-racist, and more people who are actively prepared to stand up for changing this dominant culture and its domination over policy areas, over our bodies, over our livelihoods, over our families, over our land, like whatever it is, right? And I think that's something that's taken me, I mean, it's a difficult discussion, right? I used to chair the Women's Campaign School, where we would train women from all, like, it was completely agnostic to party background. I left that because I just felt like I didn't need to elect more conservative women. Someone may need to, and I'm not saying, like, I think it's a morally gray area for me, but I just, in terms of life energy, I felt I needed to put more time into getting feminists elected. But yeah, it's amazing. Like, I worked in nonprofits for a long time. I still do a lot of work in the nonprofit world. Even the very, very best day in nonprofit land is a fraction of what you're going to get done on the worst day in elected office, right? Like, you having that power matters. It makes a huge amount of difference. I don't think, I mean, we can get into it when we talk about supports, but like what Rhiannon needed was a support team. What I needed, what probably would have kept me going and might have even convinced me to run for mayor, was if I'd been more intentional and we had more of a culture of a broader support network, right? Because it is that tough. So big payoff, but you're gonna need support to be able to realize that payoff on behalf of the people you're there fighting.
So why did I love it? Why did I do it? Was that the question?
And this is a lead into why you're encouraging other women to run or think about running.
Why did I do it? I did it because I had spent so many years as a youth worker, as a child and youth worker, a family outreach support worker, and constantly my job was at risk, or the funding for my program was at risk by policies that were being set by people who had no idea what the fuck they were doing. So I'm like, well, we need more people who know what it's like on the front line, who know what the needs of the people actually are, to be getting into decision-making rooms. And I wanted to become the person who was creating the budgets. I'm like, if I, as a frontline worker, am always coming up against budget problems that are being dictated by someone who has no idea what we need, then I want to be the person who is in control of those budgets. So it was a stepping stone. Like some advice that I got when I was sort of contemplating how to make that happen was from Sue Hamill, and her advice to me was run where you can win. And that was something that I pondered a lot, because Delta there's a rampant racism in Delta. It's certainly not somewhere that I've always felt safe to go, but it's my home. There's lots of people were trying to encourage me to run in Vancouver or to run somewhere else or to find another riding for me to be in. And I'm like, no, I want to work where my family has always lived. I want to do it in this community. So the school board seemed like the natural first step. And, recognizing that education was a tool of genocide, and how we need to get more Indigenous people in those decision-making rooms, to shift education from being a tool and a weapon of genocide to something that it's supposed to be, which is supposed to lift people up and provide people opportunities and growth. And yeah, it was, I think part of what I like being able to get into the room, and there's always like that missing Indigenous voice, that missing equity voice, where people who have lived a privileged life who get to those tables. Like I was not the homeowner in the room. I was not the one who had talking about vacations or retreats. Like I was the one that was still living paycheck to a week before paycheck. And it was awkward. It was uncomfortable at times, but it was very necessary. For my perspective was needed. And that was always my motivation, that no one else was bringing all of these voices into that room. So I needed to do that.
And you'd encourage other women to go for it.
Yes. But like Andrea said, with eyes wide open, like I also won't sugarcoat my experience or what it's like. And I think it's important for people to recognize that when you hear the first, right, like I was the first Indigenous woman elected. I was the only Indigenous woman elected. I was the only Indigenous person in that room. I was the only Indigenous person at that table. And that's a lot of hard work when you're the only in the room. So it's really important to celebrate these champions, but we need to make sure that we remember that the only means, that the first means only. Sorry, I'm having a parenting moment here for a second.
I get that. I was the first and only lesbian in Canada, and it's not easy to break that glass ceiling. It's a pretty lonely place. Halena, why would you encourage women to run?
I made a lot of notes about this one because I think similarly, just to what the two have shared here before me, again, not based on my personal experience, based on kind of research I've done and folks I've talked with, it seems to me like it's a bit of like, I guess, like a chicken egg scenario, right? Where like, in order for more women to run, especially from diverse backgrounds, from marginalized backgrounds, from especially folks who have had a hard time or have faced lots of structural barriers to be able to run, in order for those barriers to change and for the culture to change, you need more of those folks to run and win, and then change that from those positions. But you need to change those barriers so that they can run and feel welcome and feel respected once they're there, right? Are respected once they're there. So yeah, I have heard a lot of people share different things about that. So I think about that a lot. I made so many notes that I want to look at for this part, because I was thinking about this one a lot, especially. Yeah, I wanted to mention a few things around like, folks have told me a lot about how, just the expenses of running a campaign, the time that you need to door knock and leaflet and attend all the events and everything you need to do. And just, of course, acknowledging that women do still tend to do most of the domestic work and childcare work. And especially if you're working, you might be trying to juggle all of these things rather than, I think was mentioned before, like being able to take time off or have a bunch of savings that you can put aside to then pay for the campaign and take time off for that. And actually during the pandemic, I think there's some research now even suggesting women are taking on more of those like homeschooling positions and spending more time with the childcare and the domestic work than men are because they're at home. So there's just maybe more of that happening now as well. Also things around like the media focusing more on like women's hair and clothing and whether you look old or tired or like commenting on your appearance, commenting on these superficial things rather than talking about your policies, your proposals, your experience, what you actually are probably trying to talk about. So those are just some of the other things I wanted to mention. And then I think as well on this topic, it matters not just kind of what the barriers are when you're running, but of course then when you're elected, what the situation's also like. So, you know, I talk to folks who talk about, you know, even after they won the campaign, now they're in this powerful position, the media is still focusing on superficial qualities and male counterparts are talking down to them and interrupting them and still expecting them to take notes in a meeting or, you know, do all these things that are treating them in a way that's maybe not in line with their position and the kind of role that they are supposed to play as an elected representative. And then also for women I talked to who are women of color, of course, they talked about racism and microaggressions or being tokenized, maybe even by their own political party or by their own colleagues, having voters or folks they work with saying it's not appropriate for a woman of their particular race or their particular background to run for office or to be in that position. And yeah, I wanted to note as well that, so the research I've done on this is all within the past like 5 years. And even right now, I know a little bit about how there's a by-election going on in Victoria right now at the municipal level. And I have heard about how there's apparently a lot of kind of like sexist and misogynist comments and vitriol going on against this female candidate who's running for office. And that there's some of these responses leveled at current city councillors there as well. So just to say that, to note that it's not, I think even sometimes when I talk about this, people are like, oh, it can't be that bad anymore. Like it's getting better. And so it does, like, this is all pretty current stuff, but it seems this is still a problem that's happening. And then I also, in this question, was thinking, so I guess in line with this theme of kind of like going in with eyes wide open, I think as well
also,
about
a little bit more positive. We want to be encouraging women to run.
Well, yeah. I think it's important. Like, I like this frame though of like, it's good to know about what the situation is.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of see it fully so that you can make that informed decision. So I guess in that spirit, I'll share a few more thoughts about this. Yeah, like I think about, because I think there's so many pieces of it that it's important to change. I have so many thoughts about this, but what I wanted to say was, I think as well about, there's a lot of folks I know who I think wouldn't even maybe consider running in the first place, or think that that's a space where they're welcome in, because the barriers are just so high for them. So yeah, if they can't take time off work, if they think they're not like the kind of person that would be an elected representative, if they don't have the networks or like benefactors to support their campaign. Because something else I wanted to mention here, as I mentioned in my bio, I'm a dancer here in Vancouver in the dance community. And so nowadays there's a lot of people I interact with that are kind of in the arts community in Vancouver, that especially in the burlesque community in Vancouver. And folks like this, you know, there's a lot of folks who I think would make really, really wonderful elected officials. They are like, you know, small business owners. They have really good skills around like facilitation, mediation, public speaking, project management, balancing a budget, all of these really good qualities. But, you know, maybe the content they post online, maybe the work they do, maybe the type of ways they move their body is not seen as appropriate for an elected official. And so there's a lot of folks that I know that I think I would like to see. So, and I'm pausing because like, this is again where I think this chicken egg thing comes in, right? Like, I feel like I want to say, yes, all these folks should run for office. Everyone should run for office. We should get more women from these diverse backgrounds to run for office. But also I can see why, if it's not, you know, a safe place, if it's a place where they're going to be, you know, disrespected and treated poorly in the media and have such a difficult time, I think, even just being respected in that role, I can see why that would be a really kind of intimidating thing to think about, or a really difficult thing to think about doing. So that's why I think, like, maybe this is the positive. This is why I think like events like this are important, but also, especially as someone who's not in that position myself, I think a lot about like, okay, with the privileges that I have and the knowledge that I have, what can I be doing? What can we all be doing, for those of us that can, to try to make this space a safer one for people to be able to run, and to be able to be actually respected when they're elected as well, and to be able to be in that position and change that culture. So I guess we're not just relying on a few women at the beginning, kind of as you said, Rhiannon, to be the first and the only to then be in that position, and then we just expect you to change everything from within as one or two people in that position, right? We can kind of somehow have more of us involved in changing that culture, so it's not such a burden, I guess.
I'm going to add something on. Andrea, what difference do you think it's making that Kamala Harris is Vice President-elect of the United States, most powerful country in the world?
Like all the difference in the world, right? I remember many years ago seeing, God, it was back when like you had to watch things at a certain time on TV, and it was some special about women generally, like it was timed in with Clinton's Beijing summit. Anyway, there was a documentary, and Eo Brundtland, the former Prime Minister of Norway, was on. And I remember her saying, a little boy had come up to her and said, do you think it will ever be possible for a man to be president of Norway, or Prime Minister of Norway? And realizing that's all it takes. It's just one generation, right? It's like, it just radically reforms the way you see possibility and what's possible. And I think it was why it was important, you know, despite everything we've talked about, it's why I felt, I mean, I had a small child at home when I first ran, a 5-year-old, and I was making basically no money and trying to keep 3 people alive in Vancouver on that. And I just felt like what was the other option, right? Because either I kept not seeing myself represented there, or knowing how hard it is, I pushed some other poor woman into doing this, or I did it myself, right? And so, I didn't do it alone. Like, I think these stories of Western mythology around sort of a hero who just pushes through. It was a massive team of people who both got me elected and supported me when I was elected. But given the options, I think it is preferable to fight to make the space, and then to support the women that are there to continue to keep that space moving forward, so it does become a safe space. And that's like, you know, I don't agree with a lot of Kamala Harris's policies, but I sucked it up and tweeted out support for her because, and I will do my best to be there where I can be there, right? As long as she is fighting a feminist, anti-racist agenda, I'm there to support her, despite disagreements in other areas.
Rhiannon, any comments?
Yeah, so just on that encouraging why, I know Andrea touched on that you don't have a degree. I don't have a degree. I don't have a bunch of letters after my name or a doctor before my name, but I managed to figure out how to navigate the system from within. And I think it's important to remember is that it can be intimidating when you're suddenly the boss of a, like in Delta at one point, like this current superintendent is a very, very, very tall, baritone white man who is very aware of all the power and privilege that he has. And essentially I was his boss. So there's, but did I have the same education and the same experience and the same knowledge that he had? Absolutely not. But everything that I brought to the table were things that he didn't have. So I think it's important for women to remember that, and for anyone from an equity seeking group to remember that those masters in life, those master degrees in life that you have, that someone from a privileged experience is going to have no lived experience or understanding of, that's the perspective that's needed at those tables. And not to devalue or undervalue your lived experience and the things that in your world perspectives and your world views. Because when I was at the table, was I talking about like pedagogy of what needed to be happening? No, like that's not why I was at the table. But I was talking about making sure that like when we were talking one budget cycle about EAs, my comments are, how can we be having this conversation without any EAs at the table? So it's the being able to look at things from a completely different perspective compared to people who are in it every day, who are doing their jobs, and they're bringing you this information for you to review. So they're bringing it to you for your perspective and your analysis on it. And that's what's so critically important, that we get more women, more people from equity seeking groups, because where we are right now is those perspectives aren't the CAOs, they're not the superintendents, they're underrepresented in those management rooms. So if we can get more people elected, and then guess what those elected people get to do? They get to hire. They get to set the directions of those senior management teams, right? So that's what helps address a lot of those unconscious biases, to make sure that the right people are getting in the jobs. Yes, when I meant EAs, I was talking about education assistants. There's a lot of conversations in budget meetings about how dollars are allocated for education assistance and things like that. And here's my shout out to EAs and the incredible work that they do, and how grateful I am for them, and how incredibly frustrating it is that an EA is always an EA. There isn't a management pathway for an EA to get to the executive level. So their perspective and their expertise never makes it out of the classroom. And I think that's shameful. But nobody else in that bubble at that table was thinking about that.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about how difficult it is to get there, some of the problems when you're there, some of the achievements possible because you are there and you're opened the door for other women to get there. And now we're into electoral reform. What kind of electoral reform would ensure that Indigenous, Black, Asian, people of color, LGBTQ to get elected? Is there an electoral form or a combination of a number of electoral systems that would make that possible? Halena, do you want to start?
Sure. Yes, I will share some thoughts first. I really am curious what the other two of you think about this as well. Okay, I'm going to combine a few of my thoughts here. So first of all, maybe just to close a little bit of a gap, at least that I have in my brain, is why does it matter to change the system in terms of getting more women elected? And this goes to something I think that Andrea said before, when I was doing my research, at least there's kind of these, I promise I won't get too jargony with the academia, I will try real hard. But there's these two types of representation, basically symbolic and substantive. And again, this is kind of what Andrea already talked about, that like symbolically, it is really important to have women in these positions that you can look up and see someone that looks like you in a position within this democratic system, right? And this goes for folks of all different backgrounds. If you can look and see someone like you is there, you feel represented, you feel seen, that is really important, kind of in a symbolic sense. To motivate you, to make you feel like you can do it too, to kind of have that, all of that really importance there. And then the substantive part of the representation is like, are these people fighting for your interests when they're elected? So again, this is, and even on this, it's not like, you know, there's this concept of like women's issues. I don't mean that. I mean, like, are they using like a feminist lens? Are they using an intersectional lens? And sort of to what Rhiannon was just saying as well, are they like, there's experiences that people just don't have if they don't come from certain things, they can't speak to it, they don't know, they wouldn't have thought of it that way. But if they are there at the table making that decision, then of course they can add that in and be like, well, actually in my experience it's played out this way, or like, have we thought about this side effect or this consequence that affects this community that has never been represented here before, so no one thought about it before, right? So there's all of those kind of substantive pieces as well. And so I think there's a lot of reasons why changing the electoral system will improve both of those pieces, which is then really important. So that, at least in my mind, hopefully that kind of helps make the case for why it's important. So, okay, we defined some things already. I want to note, and Joy said a little bit about this at the beginning as well, that proportional systems do tend to make it easier for women for a few reasons that we know from the research. So in kind of first past the post systems where there's just the one person that can win, whoever gets the most votes in that area, they win, and the rest of the candidates, all of those votes don't go towards electing anyone or any party. It's a really competitive system, right? By which I mean there's just one kind of spot available. So it favors usually incumbents over challengers because, and the incumbent is the one who was elected before, because they probably have more name recognition, more maybe they've been in the papers or people know them more. So especially if there's more men in those positions already, it can be harder for women to then get in. And also in proportional systems, because there's more than one person that you can vote for, more than one kind of like only that one spot, the winner takes all, there's a higher chance that more women will be elected because there's just more kind of spots that could be available. And then also there's some research suggesting that in proportional systems, the parties, if there's political parties, are usually incentivized to run more women and more candidates of color, people from diverse backgrounds, because it looks good for a party if they can put forward this slate of candidates that's really diverse and reach a wider range of voters. Because again, they're not just looking for like one of their people to win, they're looking for all of the votes for their party to matter. So it kind of affects how people vote a little bit as well. And then one tiny maybe academic thing to share is that there has been a bunch of research more at the federal level. For example, a study in 2012 that found that among different countries that have different systems, electoral systems, the share of women in parliamentary bodies that had proportional systems was 8 points higher than in countries that didn't. So there is a lot of research suggesting that if we change to a more proportional system, it will be really positive for women especially, so that's good. So here in Vancouver then, I think, yes, we should have a more proportional system, but this is why I'm curious what the other two of you think, because I am not convinced yet of any one particular system. So to come back to something shared at the beginning, I was part of the Independent Election Task Force, which was a task force from the City of Vancouver started in 2016. We delivered 2 reports to City Council in 2017 and then again in 2019. And one of the main recommendations we made was about electoral reform. And so what we recommended there was for City Council to move to adopt a proportional representation system. But we wanted to do that through the city establishing a citizens assembly that would bring together a representative group of folks residents from across the city that would then come together and learn about the different systems, learn about the different options, and then make a recommendation. So I don't know. I'm not sure at this point in time what the appetite is from the city for a citizens assembly, but I think something like that where people that are in the city are helping to choose what the exact system is would be beneficial. But with that said, yes, let's change it in some way. The other thing though, but I don't know if we're going to get too in the weeds about this, but in Vancouver, if we did want to make any change to the system at all, it needs to get provincial government approval. So there's like this added layer of it. Do you want me to get into that jargony side? Maybe I'll leave that aside for now.
I think you have to mention it because
Okay.
we're caught by the charter.
Yeah. So yeah, if folks don't know, because I certainly did not, there's a provincial government legislation called the Vancouver Charter, which only applies to Vancouver as it is its name, and basically governs a lot of things about how the city of Vancouver can and can't make decisions. And it has pretty kind of confining language about how ballots can be marked. Like it's very specific in terms of how the city of Vancouver can run its elections. So any change that we would want to make in terms of like how voters mark their ballots, how the system works overall, would need the city council can pass a bylaw, but then it needs to get approved by the lieutenant governor. So basically by the provincial government. So there's that added step of like, it's not actually as easy to do. Andrea, I'm sure you can talk about that more though. You've actually been in that position, but that's maybe a kind of a brief overview. Yeah, I'll stop now. I want to hear what the other two think about if you have ideas about specific systems you want to see, or just sort of in general, we need it to be more proportional.
Yeah, I can jump in. I mean, what I would say is actually the city can't pass a bylaw. It doesn't even have the right to pass a bylaw on anything other than wards versus at large. Those are the only 2 electoral systems that the current charter allows. So having a citizens assembly to discuss issues that the city is not legally able to even request approval of seems antithetical to a fair engagement process, right? Like I teach engagement, and it's not the way that you generally would do engagement, because you're leading people to believe that an outcome is possible that isn't possible. You could do it saying, this is not possible, this is just theoretical, but then you're missing out on a whole whack of people who might otherwise participate, right? And whose voices really need to be heard there. I think that's the conundrum that Vancouver's been in for a long time on these issues around electoral reform. That was his problem with finance reform, right? Like why the province of BC cares what the rules are in Vancouver, I don't know, but they've maintained control over that. I might back up a bit because I think, yeah, in this, well, I know it's not just me. I don't know how widespread it is, but I'm going to say it just because I feel like I know it was a major aha moment for me. So I mentioned the whole Trump thing and why I left. The whole Trump thing was a very shorthand for a lot of things. But why I ultimately decided I didn't want to run again, why I wanted to step out and do some thinking about what, if anything, I could bring to bear on trying to fix this broken system. And, you know, I mean, Halena spoke to you talked about what can you get done in elected office. Halena was on a commission that I championed to establish because over, I don't know, Ellen, since 2002, when you first got elected to council, many requests had backlogged to the provincial government to make electoral reform changes or to study, and nothing was happening. And finally, it was like we don't have an independent elections body, let's create one. So those are the kinds of changes you can make, right? As frustrating and challenging as it is, it's still better than nothing happening on these issues, right? So I, was really fortunate to get this fellowship to Harvard, which was incredible. And like, if you're going to study democracy, it's a great place to have a chance to do that. The aha that I wanted to mention, I think I have always thought of democracy kind of like pregnancy. Like you either are or you're not, right? You're either in a democracy or you're not in a democracy. It's not at all how it works. It's like, I think a better analogy is like self-awareness, that there's people who clearly are not at all self-aware, and there's people who are more self-aware, but there's nobody who's like, done with self-awareness. But I think we've sort of treated our democracy that way, that once you're over a certain line, you're just done. Like, this is a democracy, we don't need to fiddle with it. In democracy, I mean, I've spent a lot of time, too much time studying this, and it was not designed to work well for anyone other than the white men who designed it, right? Not because they were bad, but they just had no other perspective. I mean, they may also have been bad, but the perspective they brought to it was the perspective they had, which was that other people weren't engaged in this discussion. So if we want it to work well for women and women of color and people with disabilities and people who are poor or Indigenous women or racial, like whoever, we need to build that into it. So there's nothing unusual about having this discussion, and yet there's been everything unusual about getting these changes to happen, and even getting the structures to get the changes to happen, like the Citizens Assembly. And so the other thing I wanted to say was that electoral reform, broadly speaking, is like when you're trying to reform the apparatus of elections, the process. So I saw someone put in a thing around nominations to parties. So the whole process of the election system, how we vote, where we vote, when we vote, how the people get on the ballot, how the parties get them there. There's also an urgent need for governance reform, but that's a whole other discussion, right? Like that's like whether or not there should be a Senate, how the senators get there, so that's another piece, and these two kind of fit together. So it's not simple, and we're not given a lot of information about it. The last thing I would say, like hugely supportive of proportional representation. I respectfully disagree on the words issue. The issue has never been about the issue isn't the stats Halena gave. It's not about pro-rep or not pro-rep. It's about lists. Like Christine Boyle, who's on the call and a counselor in Vancouver, uncovered this reality that 11 of the Liberal candidates in the last election in Vancouver, out of 11 were men, right? Which looks real shitty when you put them all together into one photo. And that's what happens when you have a list. So proportional systems tend to rely on lists, like mixed proportional representation or pure proportional representation. However, STV, which is somewhat proportional, is individually based, and women have done very poorly in it, right? So you need a system that has lists if you want women to do well. But even then, it tends to be white women who do well. So you see what happened in the Vancouver Council, right? It got much less racial representation there in the last round, even though women got more representation. And we've seen the direct outcome from that in the policies that people are championing. Like it's shrunk a lot, and we need to think about how to increase that. So all to say, very supportive of pro-rep, not supportive of pro-rep systems that rely on supporting individuals. I think it has to be a list system. I think that there is some need to balance geography in Vancouver, so you couldn't just have a citywide list. You'd probably want to think a bit about quadrants or something else, but that the best and fairest way to do it is through the Citizens Assembly, and that's why we need the provincial government to say that cities need the power, money, and respect that comes along with like the 21st century, and should have the right to determine their own voting system.
Rhiannon?
Yeah, I would just say yes and. So it's really great to be pushing for electoral reform to get more women and more people from equity seeking groups elected. But there also needs to be at the same time all of the efforts going into supporting and removing those barriers for when they're there. So it's one thing to get people elected, but then if you're setting them up to fail, like these conversations have to go together. Like we can't just only be focused on how people get elected, but then what happens when they get there and how they're supported when they're there. So some things that jump out for me in my experience is just what would have been really helpful for me that would probably have let me still be a trustee today is if we'd had publicly funded elections. So we sort of seen how removing the corporate dollars and the union donations have had some impact, but it's still not a level playing field. It's still not, it still doesn't mean the same for everybody. So I still can't buy as many ads in the paper. I still can't buy as many, I can't like the signs. It shouldn't be whoever has the most signs wins. But there's so much around like that name recognition and seeing all the signs and having the names out there. If everyone had the same campaign budget, then it would have been based more on merit and more on qualifications than it would have been on whoever was able to get the most leaflets out and the most signs up and the most ads in the paper. Because you get such a bigger reach the more money that you have. And I didn't have a lot of money, and therefore I did not have a lot of reach. And then some other things that would have been incredibly helpful is childcare. There's no daycares open in the evening. So if meetings are going to be in the evening, then what am I supposed to do? It's great when to bring your, like Maylona, you've seen her already a few times today. Like I have no qualms about bringing her anywhere I go. That's how we teach our children. But I should also be able to just do one thing at a time. And then mat leave too, right? Like why we need to have some conversations around how we're supporting life givers. There's lots of imageries I've seen of people breastfeeding in Parliament, people breastfeeding here, and everyone's like, woo, look at them go, that's so powerful. And I'm like, why doesn't she get a break? Why are we rewarded? Like, why are we having so much joy and so much awe for women who are that's an incredible expectation to put on someone who's had a baby, to do that healing, to do that bonding, and sit and do all that work. So it's great that women can, we should have a choice. Like, it's fine if women want to choose to do that, but they should also have the choice to, if their body needs them to heal, they should have the ability to heal and to do that work, right? So, and I think about how many committee meetings that I was unable to go to when I had a full-time job. So how many committee meetings and things are happening in the daytime, and my stipend from the school board was not enough for me to live off of, so I had to keep my full-time job. So and being a school trustee is a part-time, full-time job, depending on how much time and effort you want to put into it, on top of already working 40 hours a week. So, and then there was a couple of instances where boards were increasing stipends, and then the public outrage about how dare they increase that stipend and how dare they do that, is these ideas that elected officials should be paid just a slight honorarium because they're of service to the community is incredibly exclusive. Because who gets to be of service to the community is usually wealthy people, people who are retired, people who have or don't have to work because their partner works enough for the both of them. So that's incredibly, excludes a huge part of the population. So we need to be having these conversations at the same time, like yes and, because we can't just have it be, we get all these people elected, but then if we're not supporting them, well, then what? So yeah, yes and.
Okay, so we've looked at a lot of things. Women Transforming Cities have been looking at this for a number of years. Andrew's worked on these issues. I've worked on this. Helena's worked on this. We have 2 years to go. The City of Vancouver, the only thing it can do is wards. We know that wards increase the possible representation of diverse, and well, there's no disaggregated data on Indigenous. We know it does increase the representation of Black, Asian, people of color. Do we do nothing? Because we think we don't want to, you're suggesting you don't want to support wards, or we support wards and then after the 2022 election, we put in some kind of pro-rep within wards. Where are people thinking we should go right now in the situation we're in Vancouver?
I'll jump in. I do, like, Rhiannon's points are so important, right? Like, the electoral system is one piece, and without fixing the pieces around it, like, again, I would still argue, like, change is just so urgent. We need to do all of these, like the yes and problem, right? So I'm not saying we don't do one until this or that. I mean, in a few cases, I think you would make, that's to me why campaign finance was so critical. Like, if you didn't solve that problem, something like STD would be fatal for women and anyone who, like, you're basically just able to buy a first place finish in an election, a Trump result. So some of the pieces that I think, like, are quite urgently needed to fix, the loophole that Rhiannon talked about still exists. So for 3 3.25 years, so until January 1st of 2022, you can raise millions of dollars for civic elections and you can spend it building lists, and it's not tracked and it's not regulated. And I'm probably sounding incredibly critical of the provincial, here I'm not. Like, I do think they were fixing a problem that had built up over 20 years in the city of Vancouver and spreading to other cities. And they had literally, like, weeks to do it after they took government in 2017 for it to matter. So I'm glad they did what they did, but now we need that loophole closed, because it's not a loophole. It's like a gaping, gnawing, yawning expanse and chasm that most people are going to fall through. The mayor of Vancouver is clearly raising money right now. The NPA is raising money. It's all dark. We will never know how much money it is or what it was spent on. And it means that people like Rhiannon or me or Halena are never going to be able to compete because we don't have access to that dark money. I personally would love to see, I think one of the most urgent changes that you could make, again, it does require provincial, but I think particularly in the city of Vancouver, because it has its own charter, you could kind of beta test it to allow 16-year-olds to vote in the next election. I think the younger you are, 16 and 17, I'm not trying to cut off the 7 to, like, lower the voting age to 16, because I think when I spend time with people in that age range, and I do a fair amount because they're really interested in issues like electoral reform and climate and democracy and reckons, like, the issues that make me excited, I just think you're going to see a big voting group there that's going to put votes behind people who look like the people we're talking about and us, right? I think also permanent residents, right, who tend to be a lot browner than Canadian citizens. And there's tons of places in the States that allow this to happen. So I feel like if one of the most protectionist nations on earth can do this, we could certainly figure out how to beta test it in a city where you've got tens of thousands of people who are disenfranchised. I think if you had that, this discussion around PR and proportional representation becomes an inevitability. Like, a lot of these other pieces become inevitabilities.
Okay, we've got 9 minutes left to go. Any other comments on this? Because there are some questions on the chat line. I'd like to pick up some.
Can I add, I'll try to be very brief, but I want to add something in on this. Yeah, because I think I agree. And just to clarify, maybe from my previous answer as well, I totally agree with Andrea. I think the steps that I would like to see are, like, to get the provincial change at the provincial level first in terms of the Vancouver Charter, and then move to, like, a citizens assembly or some sort of process with City of Vancouver residents to figure out what system we want here. But again, because I don't think that can happen by 2022, I agree. I really like where this conversation is going around, like, what other things can we do to make all of this easier in the long term and to build towards that. And so maybe just some other ideas to add along that line. And some of these things I think City Council now, or City Council of Vancouver has done or is is working on to some extent. We've talked about campaign finance reform, looking into maybe like randomizing the ballot so the names aren't all at the bottom or the top for everyone, depending on the alphabetizing of your name. I know, Alan, you talked about that. Having a W last name can suck if you're always at the bottom. What else? Yeah, and getting pressuring parties to run more diverse candidates, events like this, campaign schools, networking events, so that folks without the resources in the capital can build those up and then be in a better position if they want to run in the future. And I think also worth pointing out here is that the City of Vancouver has passed mandates. This one again goes to Andrea Reimer for it, the mandate to have at least 50% women on its advisory committees. And then last year they passed another one to have at least 50% people from equity-seeking groups on advisory committees. So I think that's also a major way that hopefully we can kind of begin to build some of this out over time, is to make sure that through being involved in making recommendations to the city, being consulted by the city, folks are involved in advisory committees as well in a more diverse way. Yeah.
Rhiannon, anything further, or should I go to questions? Are there any questions that any of you would like to pick up on that are on the chat line? Someone's referring to Samsara's site. 2020 Samsara's vision remains one where active citizens have a shared sense of purpose and commitment to democracy, and where public leaders are compassionate, collaborative, and far-sighted. Our work remains nonpartisan, evidence-driven, and centered on strengthening Canada's representative democracy. I don't know their work. Andrea, do you know them?
Fantastic, and really worth following. There's a woman who was in charge of it, and I think she okay, now I'm like, am I misremembering that? Anyway, anything you'd see online, you would see was the result of a woman-led organization. And I think in general, they try to put a good gender analysis on things. If I could only leave one thought, and it speaks a bit to the question around how to get a party nomination and the challenges there. Politics is a team sport, like it really is. Like you've got to suck it up. And I just don't care if you don't like parties. Like you need to figure out how to like them. And the best way to do that is to get involved, because when you get elected, it's not Rhiannon's magic wand or Andrea's like, I don't know, executive fiat. It's our ability to convince 50% plus one of the elected people with us to do something, right? So the more you're able to work with people, the better you're going to do. And the stronger that, like, parties are getting pretty anemic because everybody's booking out from them. And that's why it gets harder and harder for women to get nominations. And it's why it's harder and harder to move these things forward. And so yeah, join a party, a civic party, a provincial party, a national party. The only party that will agree with everything you agree with is the one that is just you. So that doesn't exist. You're going to have to figure out like where the line is and work to change the things you don't like within the party by getting involved, not by sitting on the outside tweeting it. Although can do that too.
That's so true. When I was a number of years ago, when I was like the baby thoughts about getting active in politics, and I remember sitting in my parents' kitchen going to my dad, I'm just like, Dad, I really want to do this, but like none of the parties like are like, there's something that bothers me about all of the parties. And he just looked at me, he's like, well, pick one, join it, and fix it. So I mean, like that's so true, Andrea. It's just that it is there's that party work. Like there's all the different steps that you have to take. Like in like a big city like Vancouver, there are lots of steps that you have to take, right? Like you can't just decide that I'm going to get my name on the ballot and think that you're going to get elected. Like there's all those things that you need to do ahead of time. So now is the time to start 2 years out, to start figuring out what those steps are. What relationships you need to build. And I really love that talking about it as a team sport, because that's such an incredible perspective to have on it. Just one of the questions from in the Q&A, wondering what the speakers thought about identifying as a feminist, intersectional feminist, and what kind of impact this can have on when you're running for political office. So, you know, there's a lot of different opinions in Indigenous matriarchs about whether even feminism is even something for Indigenous women. It's, yeah, like I like, for me, like I think I probably lean more towards like being an intersectional feminist. Like I think feminism is too often like white feminism, and it isn't for everybody or all bodies. So I think that is important to remember all of that, and what kind of impact it can have lots of different impacts. Like it can help you find your people, it can help you find your community, it can help you find voices that need to be amplified. And I can tell you that not everybody likes it. I've knocked on my fair share of doors and go, we want to champion more equity in the schools. And they're like, I don't care about that, thanks, shut the door. So it's those thoughts are about identity. Like I think you have to do that personal work of really understanding your own personal identity, what that means to you, who you are, because all of that is going to be on display. So you have to have that confidence. You have to have that real deep understanding of what your motivation is for running. Why are you running? What's important to you? And what are your values? If you don't have a concrete understanding of what your values are and what they look like, lots of voters will pick up on that, and they can smell the stink on that.
Thank you, everybody, so much. This is really exciting. We now have a number of groups in Vancouver talking about different possibilities of electoral reform. Surrey is considering electoral reform and using wards. So Women Transforming Cities will continue this discussion. We hope to see you there. Trudy Gell and Nadine Nakagawa are setting up a women's campaign school. So get in touch with them if you're interested in being part of that and thinking about running for office. We will put a link to this up on our website and a link to some of these resources. But there are, as I said, a number of different groups talking about this, and the Women Transforming Cities will follow up on this. We'd like to invite you to pay attention to our Watch Council. We're taking a look at the city budget, and we're concerned that they make sure that they fund fully the equity projects that they've started, and stick to at least 5% tax increase. They could take some of the police budget to fund other things that need to be funded. There's lots of ways to fund what needs to be done, but you got to call them and let them know what's important to you. On November 30th, Women's Transforming Cities have our annual general meeting, and the newly chosen Chief Electoral Equity Officer, Aftag Ertag, is going to be speaking at that. So join Women Transforming Cities on our website if you'd like to hear her and talk to her about how you put a gender intersectional lens on the institution of the city. And there's also a very important motion on climate change going forward this week. So I hope you'll try to speak to that if you aren't already signed up. And we look forward to seeing you again at some of our other initiatives. And I'd just like to do a shout out to Rhiannon, who's doing some amazing decolonization workshops. And she's just in the midst of one right now that's pretty amazing, but I'm sure she'll be doing other ones. Follow the work of Halena, and Andrea's up to all kinds of wonderful mischief in lots of different places. So we hope you'll follow her, follow Transforming Cities website, our Facebook site, our Instagram, and LinkedIn if you want to share other ideas with us. Thanks for everyone behind the scenes. Hey, hi, how are you doing? Oh, we look forward to talking to you again, and thank Ash Peplobal, Joy Masahara, Michelle, and others who helped make this possible. Look forward to seeing you again.